Hello everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today, and I'll start proceedings by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional, acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and their ongoing struggle for justice. And I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal people who are here today, and also people with lived experience of mental ill health and recovery, and the people who love and care for them. So I'll just go through a couple of little housekeeping matters to start off with. This is the second Collective Purpose Speakers Series, and we are actually very privileged to have Sara Lambert here to talk to us about the outcome of the Marriage Equality Postal Survey and where to now for LGBTIQ mental health. But before that, I'll just let you know that the toilets are opposite the lifts outside. We go get to them through this door on this occasion, and obviously go whenever you feel the need. We actually have put out a number of forms on people's chairs, which include an evaluation for how the whole thing went afterwards. But more importantly, we've got some paper there for you to write questions, and that can be questions that you've had for a while, or questions that occur to you during the course of proceedings in response to Sarah's speech. We'll be collecting those and giving everyone a 10-minute break to go and get another little drink or some more refreshments while we go through them quickly, and then we will put the questions to Sara so that she can answer some representative queries. The ones that we don't get to tonight we'll be giving to Sara, and there'll be responses made available. So no matter what your query might be, I'm sure that we'll get an adequate response. So those matters being dealt with. Sara Lambert is the Director of Community Health and Regional Services for ACON, the AIDS Council of New South Wales, and ACON is an organisation that the Collective Purpose Partners here today work with on a number of mutual projects. We're all very supportive of mental health for access for people, particularly from populations that might need additional support to be able to get their needs met. I should, I suppose, name the Collective Purpose Partners, and they are constituted by the WayAhead Mental Health Association of New South Wales, Being, formerly the Consumer Advisory Group, which is the peak body for people with lived experience of mental ill health and recovery, and Mental Health Carers New South Wales, which is the peak body for the families and carers of people with the experience of mental ill health. All of the Collective Purpose Partners were very happy to support a yes vote for the Marriage Equality Postal Survey, although we were a little disappointed that the Parliament didn't feel that it could simply march down the hall and vote for something which seemed to have, and indeed proved to have, overwhelming community support. It should be self-evident that appropriately acknowledging and respecting nurturing adult relationships is good for the people who are having those relationships and help support their mental health. Inclusion and recognition of all the members of our society and all the appropriate relationships in our society is of course a big step forward for the community, and liable to reduce the feelings of exclusion or self-judgment that people might live with if they don't come from the mainstream when it comes to things such as sexual orientation or any other element of their background, which for some reason doesn't necessarily receive the standard level of support and approval that everybody else does. We can see very similar issues with the Indigenous community and how their recognition as human beings and citizens has contributed to some significant improvements in their lot since the referendum in 1967, although as we've learnt even today, there's certainly quite a lot of work to go there. But in the early 90s in Australia, we were debating whether or not homosexuality should be legal and whether people with same-sex orientation should be allowed to go free or should be locked up. Throwing prayer rabbit into the briar patch was the joke that people would make at the time, but there's actually no laughing matter, and it's actually very clear that when the community does endorse the validity of people, when we actually do get, on those rare occasions, leadership from our politicians and other community leaderships, that leaders that demonstrate that such people are worthy of respect and should be included, that the rest of the community does follow. And we can certainly see the growth of the welcoming, the inclusion, the acceptance of gay people since the early 90s, since the decriminalisation of homosexuality, has come a hell of a long way, and that was reflected in the 62% vote in favour of same-sex recognition. It does seem inescapable, doesn't it, that excluding certain classes of relationships and refusing to acknowledge that they should be recognised on the same basis is going to cause mental health problems. It's going to cause people to feel anxious and rejected and not fully fledged partners of the community that they live in. So, having set up or framed the discussion that's going to come, I'll now hand over to Sara Edwards. Sara Lambert. And I'd ask you all to welcome her to speak on this important topic.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. You probably kept going and covered everything, which is great. I'm just going to bring up my timer because I'm going to give myself a warning, just to keep track of things. So that's excellent. Thank you so much for coming along today. That's helpful. Look, we're thrilled to be invited along at the second meeting of the Collective series, and it's wonderful to see such a, showing of commitment for our communities for the attendees today, and the response that I understand WayAhead have had. That's just brilliant. So I'm going to be talking about after marriage equality. Now, we've obviously all experienced and ridden through that, but as we know with these things, it's not done and dusted just when the official stamps are done. There's impacts and there's lasting, experiences that go on. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that today, and look, we're really thrilled to be part of WayAhead, and we really work with community partners. Mental health is an area that our communities have starkingly higher disparities of experience. However, it's an area that we know we need to do a lot more work, and funding in a lot of ways eludes us. So this is not possible without partnership work. And with WayAhead, we work with Mental Health Month, the community small grants for LGBTI community members, suicide prevention, they're on our advisory group for the work we're doing with GPs, and also community aftercare support. And the LGBTI anxiety group is hosted at ACON as well, so they're wonderful initiatives. So I'll start by just mentioning what ACON is. ACON's been around for 33 years. We came together at the start of the HIV epidemic when we saw gay and bisexually active men dying at incredibly high rates and such high levels of distress that was as a result occurring. That's then continued to grow, and as we recognise other health needs in addition to HIV, in 2009 we expanded to be a broader LGBTI health portfolio addressing a range of health needs, mental health being one which has certainly been identified as high priority. So before I kick, I'm going to... There we go. This is the overview of what we're going to do. And to start with, I'd really like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people on which we meet, and of the nations of those who are watching by streaming. We pay respect to elders past, present, emerging, and anyone who are with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge the lived experience of people with mental illness, consumers, and carers for their strength, resilience, and their own contributions. And it's also really timely that I'd like to also acknowledge the contributions of LGBTI elders on whose shoulders we stand. This is very timely. It's the 40th anniversary of Mardi Gras and that march which sparked, and the struggles that we're leading up to and that played out in quite violent ways. So it's important that I pay my respects for that too. So marriage equality, it's very much a health issue. It's not just about a right. A right is extremely important human rights framework, but it is a health issue, and this is why so many health organisations have got behind this need. And it was really key when it came to marriage equality that it was actually painted as not only a human rights, but also a health issue. So I'm going to start by just covering a little bit about the LGBTI community, or communities, which are extremely diverse. There's diversity within the communities, there's lots of subgroups. There's also diversity within diversities, where we've got cultural groups and ages and all the rest. So it's a melting pot, and it's a wonderful, wonderful community to be a part of. It's very hard for us to say what the population looks like. Data is not available, nor is it representative. So when we look at the ABS data with the census, it only collects data on couples, which is very limiting. It doesn't give us much information, and anyone who was hoping that there'd be better gender questions, a whole lot of barriers for that this year. You actually had to get a separate form posted to you. So there's a lot of work to be done in that space, and so it's really difficult to know what this community looks like and to help inform responses to health needs. We estimate about 12%, though we think that's really conservative. It's much, much higher, particularly with younger people who are identifying as being a lot more gender and sexually fluid. And certainly when we talk about sexuality, sexual attraction's a big part, and that doesn't necessarily go with identity either. There's actually 3 parts when it comes to sexuality. So the alphabet soup, which is LGBTI, the sexuality is really covered off by lesbian, gay, and bisexual. But then you've also got queer, or people who don't want to identify in either of those categories. It's very important I make a clear distinction that gender identity is not about sexuality. They're 2 separate things that play out. So one person might actually be identifying as having a diverse sexuality, may be actually within the binary or outside of the binary, where I talk about binary being male or female. So they're 2 different things, so people can have multiple identities within their own identity. Transgender, which is the T in their acronym, is the umbrella term for anyone whose identity is different to that assigned at birth. It's estimated that's about 2% of the population have a transgender experience. Gender diversity includes transgender people, but also those who identify as agender, not having a gender, bigender, having both male and female expressions and identities, and non-binary, neither. And we estimate that people who have a diverse gender experience is about 10 to 15% of the population. So when we look at these figures, they're not small, they're not insignificant. They're a significant proportion of our community, and more as we go beyond tolerating through to celebrating and embracing, we'll see these numbers actually reflected. We just now need to capture it. The one term that you might hear around the place is cisgender. If anyone's heard cisgender? Yep, great. It means one's self-perception of gender matches their sex assigned at birth. So myself, I identify as a cisgender woman. So I don't have a trans or gender diverse experience. So that's just a term that you'll hear around the place. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a taste, and people might be a bit more familiar with the language that I'll be using over this presentation. And we do whole workshops on LGBTI. So I'm sorry we've just glossed over that pretty quickly. So the mental health of LGBTI people. We know we're at increased risk of mental health issues. I'm going to go into this in a bit more in depth in the next slide. We've got higher rates of AOG use. We're early adopters of substances. We use at higher rates, for longer periods of time and often in different contexts, including socialising and within sexual behaviours and practices. So it's very different, and it's something that our community grapples with. HIV is still an ongoing issue within our communities and health need. Gay men actually account for up to 75% of HIV notifications annually, and you're looking at 1,000 people annually being diagnosed with HIV. So it's not something that's gone away, and people are living longer term, and it's an ageing population that's living longer term. And with that, there's a whole lot of psychosocial and comorbidities associated. LGBTI people are more likely to experience harassment, stigma and discrimination, going back to what Jonathan said about the criminalisation. And there's a real reluctance of our communities to speak out when they do have these experiences, to report to police and to access services. And there's multiple reasons why that is the case. We also have high rates of DFE. Similar rates compared to heterosexual women. We're looking at 1 in 3 of our community members in a lifetime, and trans women being certainly even higher. So it's significant amounts, and a lot of this is also about not having good role models and healthy relationships that we can look to. So again, complex issue, probably do a whole presentation on that alone. Risk of cancers. We acknowledge we've got additional risk factors, we're less likely to screen, we're less likely to have our needs in campaigns. And so we also have significantly higher rates of smoking. We're the one population where you're not seeing smoking rates going down. They're actually staying pretty stable and even going up within women, young women. And lastly, social isolation, particularly with youth and older LGBTI people. And that's around people feeling like they can be their authentic selves and that it's safe to do so. So the picture sounds pretty grim, but I want to underline that there's incredible resilience, incredible strength, and it's a community that's used to doing for itself. And we do pretty well with that. We're getting better at also working with others and reaching out, and that's really important. And one thing about LGBTI communities' health is it's everyone's responsibility as health service providers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mental health in a little bit more depth. So there's elevated risks of suicide. The research talks to different figures, generally 3.5 to 14 times higher than the general population. That's startling. It's really, and it's higher rates amongst certainly trans populations and regional rural LGBTI people. We have significantly higher rates of depression and anxiety. Australian Private Lives 2, which is one of the biggest surveys on health needs of our communities, found that 80% of participants reported at least one period of intense anxiety in the 12 months preceding the survey. 30.5% were diagnosed or treated with depression, and 22.3% for anxiety over a 3-year period before that survey. And if we know the stats, that's actually significantly higher than the general population. Higher rates that I mentioned again of alcohol and drug use, so there's a strong link with mental health around that. Self-medicating, but also exacerbating mental health needs. Intersex people report even higher levels of distress, and that's around not having to actually navigate a world which is binary and the distress that that gives. So if you, even things like accessing toilets, looking at forms, all these things that ask you to put yourself in a box where you don't see yourself, has a distress impact. Now, unfortunately, we don't know much about the rates of severe mental illness amongst our communities. We can assume that it's similar rates, but perhaps higher burden of disease or higher impacts on quality of life as a result of the other factors and also access to services. Something to note is that almost half of our communities hide their sexuality or their gender identities in fear of being stigmatised and discriminated against. Young people even more so. And obviously if you can't be your authentic self, that has a huge impact on our mental health and well-being. So why are things different? You might hear the phrase minority stress around the place. It's talking about a compounding experience of being marginalised. And this can peak and be triggered over different points in time across the lifespan. And it's very much a factor, and you see it play out in people's psychosocial experiences and their quality of life. We know that intersex people report similar experiences of distress with the binary experience, even though somewhat they're separate to the alphabet in lots of other ways. They have that experience in the world. The high rates of self-harm, suicidal thoughts are linked to ongoing harassment and violence. Again, if people can't be their authentic places in a range of environments, being home, work, school, in the community, it has direct impacts. And we know that the onset of mental health disorders across the general population actually coincides with sexuality and formation of sexual identity, being in the youth and young adult range. And so that's a crucial time of development. And it means that that person has a number of different implications for the services and the institutions in which they come in contact. So that's something to keep in mind for schools, higher education institutes, workplace, health services. Being mindful that you will have young people presenting who are LGBTI or young people who are struggling. We know that LGBT people are lowest help seeking than with professionals. It's that fear of how am I going to be responded to? Am I going to have to answer questions that I can't see myself? Am I going to feel uncomfortable in that situation and actually need to educate the person who's across from me because that's actually not meeting my needs? All those things come into place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can be inclusive and welcoming and engage with mental health, people with mental health experiences in our community. So it's very much about fear of stigmatisation. There's a reluctance to disclose sexual orientation and or to be misgendered. And by misgendered I mean using pronouns that don't fit, which is really actually quite impacting. There are concerns around confidentiality and privacy. What's going to happen to their disclosures? What happens within a team? What happens when I'm being referred somewhere else? Where is that information going to end up? Will I know people? Even within LGBTI services who are coming in where it's peers, it's actually, do I know the person who's delivering the service to me and do they know everyone in my circle? It's a small community. I mentioned lack of role models. This is crucial. It's really hard to be what you cannot see. And that means in the media, and not just the negative stuff, but the positive stories. And to actually see us represented in health campaigns and brochures and all those things. Social isolation is a factor, whether we're talking about regional, rural, where obviously smaller communities, people know a lot more about one another. Also less services available. And often it's your GP that looks after your whole family is the one that you'll go and see, and the concerns around privacy and confidentiality that play out, or the uncomfortableness of it. Socioeconomic factors can be very limiting. We certainly see that with older lesbians and older HIV positive people, where with housing shortages, people being moved out of the inner west and the inner city areas where our communities thrive and have for a long time for lots of reasons. And older people particularly going into residential care. I mean, that's a huge barrier and what that impacts. But being removed from their community, and with that, communities of choice, which means beyond your immediate family. I've mentioned a few times, but the systemic homophobia and exclusion. What we're seeing is a shift in this, so a lot less physical violence and assault, not to say it doesn't happen, and it's probably hugely underreported, but we're actually seeing a shift in more covert and ambiguous ways in which this plays out. Society is saying it's not okay, so it's shifting in how it's done. So it'll be things like anti-gay jokes, things like, oh, that's so gay, slurs, derogatory remarks, outing of people without their permission, isolating or excluding people, whether that's intentional or not. Just even talking about family arrangements and things can be quite isolating for our communities. Systemic forms of discrimination. I'll go back to that point actually about isolate and exclude. I mean, I worked in a service where there were quite a few queer people, which was great. I knew of a colleague who never had Mother's Day acknowledged in all those years in our department until a few other queer people came along to the department. And it's not intentional, it just isn't thought about. Systemic forms of discrimination. Marriage has been a big one, a huge one. But there's still things like with gaps within legislation, for example, birth certificates and things where people have to get their names changed, and at the moment there's a push for reform in that area. So the problem with systemic stuff is it's acutely felt, and if that's the world you're navigating, it's extremely frustrating, whether it's the university's form that doesn't have what you need, or it's you actually need to change your passport, and that is such a process. It's all those things that keep validating that you are different. I haven't given you a whole lot of literature or references. They can be found in our mental health outcome strategy, which is a booklet sitting on our website. Please go and look at it. It gives you the literature, it gives you a lot more depth than what I provided there, but it also talks a little bit about ACON's programs. So that's the landscape around mental health. So what happened with marriage equality that we all lived through, and what was being felt by our communities? Now, ACON was a partner with Australians for Marriage Equality, and both in terms of supporting the campaign, but also behind the scenes, we did a lot of stuff there. And hopefully I'll be able to answer some of your questions, and if I can't, I'll sort them later. But we all know it was a real heightened attention on LGBTI people, not seen since the peak of the HIV epidemic. And for particularly younger generations, it was the first time they were coming under such public scrutiny, and the first time they were needing to justify their relationships to broader society beyond their own circles. So LGBTI rights are really a human right and a health issue. So in terms of human rights, it's stated in the UN Declaration of Human Rights that marriage is actually pointed to around regardless of someone's sexuality and gender. But the right to choose one's partner should be a basic human right of sexual citizenship. There are legal, moral, political and economic benefits to having marriage equality. And it's been shown that it actually reduces public discord and social conflict. So in the countries that came before us, there's extensive research on the benefits that came about as a result of marriage equality. And in time, greater social acceptance. And I think we can say that's actually what we've seen a lot. That said, it's been a hard road. Things like reproductive rights, impacted by marriage equality and access to IVF and other options. And financial benefits, both in terms of tax, wills, all those things. So they all have implications. On the health side, enhance the authenticity of self and intimate relationships. That speaks to mental health and quality of life. If you can't be yourself, that's not great. Protective mental health benefits, basically of being embraced. Improved healthcare utilisation has been shown in, particularly in the United States, in the states which adopted marriage equality earlier, the rates of access actually changed. And that's also because people started to pay attention, started to ask people, so they knew who was accessing the services. From that comes public health benefits in terms of access, and also reduced health-related costs because people are more likely to access services and support earlier. So there's an economic benefit as well, and certainly improves the burden on health services. So it was found that in the States, due to the added value for the health of lesbians and gay men, there was different support systems and cultural significance in marriage for these communities compared to heterosexual. So it's other advantages on top of having marriage equality that you'd see with the general population. So what happened? Do you remember filling this out? We ended up with a postal survey, and there was a huge lead up. I mean, really, it's been going on for years, the debate and the throwing around of stuff. We saw debates around, was this going to be a plebiscite? There was High Court challenge. There was then the debates around what's the postal survey going to look like, who's going to look after it, what are the questions. Like, it was drawn out. And through all that, LGBTI people were very much holding their breaths and having to often deep dive to look after themselves. What we ended up with is a non-compulsory, non-binding postal survey, which really was designed to fail. So we ended up voting, and there being campaigns, both with the Yes for Australians for Marriage Equality and the Coalition for Marriage being the no side. It's really problematic because we were saying it's okay to vote on people's rights. And we must acknowledge that within this, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people know that experience all too well. I guess what is a little bit different for LGBTI people is this was not a constitutional requirement. It was a complete political football. And that's not to say that isn't the case for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders either. So through this time, ACON knew that we were in for a bit of a rough road, whatever it came to. And we actually had these resources developed, and we worded it so it could be any outcome, whether it was a survey or plebiscite or whatever it was we were going to end up with. These were developed in anticipation, still very much relevant, and some of the information I'm presenting can be found in them. So the first one is a bibliography, annotated bibliography looking at the evidence of marriage equality and the health benefits across worldwide. And the other one was a guide for support services on how to support LGBTIQ people during the marriage equality debate. Both can still be found. The one guide for services particularly talks about inclusive practice, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more depth soon. So these are the images that we saw over this period. The good, the bad, and the really ugly. So it was really hard not to go anywhere without seeing them. Certainly hard for the general population. Imagine what it was like for LGBTI people. And we heard things like, oh my gosh, I can't even look at the sky without being told I'm wrong with the skywriting. So it was acutely felt, not only in the negative messaging, but that the debate was happening at all and that it was okay. And certainly, like a lot of people, I remember riding public transport and going, all you people get to vote on me. This is not right. How is this? How's this going to be after when I've got to ride the same train? I don't know what the outcome is. So it's acutely felt. So Australians for Marriage Equality developed a real grassroots campaign. Ian Thorpe is one of the images that they used, high-profile people to help spread the word. And it aimed to personalise the issue and to mobilise yes voters and the apathetic. The challenge was not just to vote yes, it was to get people to fill out the survey and to use a postal system. A lot of people who don't do post very much these days. So a little bit like, I guess, in America where people have to get out to vote, and that's one of the steps. We had that challenge too. With the campaign, there was a conscious effort to avoid getting into mudslinging by using positive messages and not getting into the anti-no campaign. And the general media the mainstream media tried to make that happen all the time. And so Australians for Marriage Equality really focused on local sources of media, which told stories and wasn't about the argy-bargy of the different mudslinging that could happen. So we refused to be drawn into those fights. The strategy was that if you know someone affected, then you are more likely to respond positively and vote yes. It's very hard to deny someone a right when you know that it's a real person. It's really hard for the grandma to say no to their grandchild. It's very hard for the neighbour to say no to the couple who live next door to them. And that's what the campaign was about. Given that it's a human rights and a health issue, there were a whole lot of signatories to the campaign, and these were the first call out, and there's about another 100+ signatories, which is brilliant. So we found ourselves in this climate. We found ourselves facing a survey. A couple of resources that ACON put out, and I put them up because they're actually our largest cutting through campaign ever, which is amazing. This one here, within less than 24 hours, was shared 24,000 times, which is pretty amazing for social media numbers. And the first one was about staying strong during the marriage equality debate. So what can we do for ourselves as community members? And a lot of services actually wanted to use that in their own areas. So we had clients, community groups, service providers, employers all using that. And we're talking about the big banks that we have programs for. All sorts of people were using that one. As we got closer to the outcome, we produced another one around Stronger Together, and we wrote that one knowing that it could be a yes or a no vote. And so we hedged our bets, hoping for the best, anticipating or planning for the worst if that had happened. So that one went out again, and it was well received. Not quite as well received as the first one, but certainly it did well. And ACON with Australians for Marriage Equality used Stronger Together as a branding that we did, and we distributed a whole lot of badges and things in the celebration that happened. So the result, well, you all know the result. We ended up with yes, almost 62% in favour. And if you looked at the actual electorate breakdown, it was really great. It was great to see. There were small electorates in Queensland, and certainly in New South Wales we saw Western Sydney where there was the no vote. And we saw regional areas where everyone thought it was going to be a no vote really mobilise and end up with overwhelming yes votes, some as high as in the 70s and the early 80s. So they did a great job. And it was people like Nora down in Nowra who was door knocking that made that happen. Or, oh gosh, I can't even tell you all the stories of regional New South Wales. It's just beautiful to see what was happening at a real grassroots level. So no regional area voted no in New South Wales. That's something to be absolutely celebrated and recognised. And they did that with a grassroots response. And it's pretty common for us to all think that regional rural areas and perhaps they're a little bit backward or not embracing of our communities, but they clearly are. And again, it was local paper, local people putting their faces out there, which made the difference. The no vote in southwest Sydney, it was heavily targeted by the No campaign, with the need for Australians for Marriage Equality to get out the yes voters and the people who were less likely to do the survey they were in support. It didn't have as much targeted import, and it just couldn't. Also, the local media weren't as keen to run the stories, so that was a bit of a barrier for them. But that said, the No campaign also did a highly targeted campaign of those areas, recognising the cultural diversity. And so they were very good at using inaccurate information and putting it in community native language and doing the fear-mongering. So we just need to be aware that actually that's an area of New South Wales we need to give a lot of love. A lot of love for LGBTI people who are living there, for those who voted yes, and also for the no supporters, because they too were a victim, I guess, in some of this misinformation. So there's work to be done there too. It's important to say that while we see silver linings, this has come at a great expense to LGBTI communities in the shorter term. The same result could have been achieved by a free vote in Parliament, and it should have been. And it would have been done without the associated harms. And members of the community should never have their rights put into a plebiscite, and it's really important that we make sure that doesn't ever happen again. Just checking my time. Darn the phone when it chimes out on you. All right, impacts of the survey. Oh, no, I missed a page. That's all right, let me go back. Impacts of the survey. So we had increased demand on support services. You had Reach Out, Q Life and Lifeline all having significant increases, up to 40% being accessed. Heightened vigilance, anxiety and re-traumatisation, particularly, that's my warning to let me know I've got 10 minutes. Okay, good. Particularly older LGBTI people and those living with HIV, it was a reminder to what days had been like, and they were extremely concerned for LGBTI youth. There was internalised homophobia and isolation. By that saying, people were actually, playing out the messages and owning them as their own. There was exacerbation of AOD use. Our substance support service at ACON saw heightened access during that time. People reported feeling unsafe in public spaces and actually withdrew a lot. There were occasions of vilification, harassment, bullying, physical assaults and property damage. And the transgender community and rainbow families became a big kicking ball, and they were brought into a debate that actually wasn't about their needs, their issue entirely. It was made about safe schools. It was made about people's expression of gender, though there was a part to play in that experience of marriage equality, but it became about more than that. And it became about reproductive rights and all sorts of things. So some of the things that we heard which have submitted to the Senate inquiry were things like a parent whose child asked whether if the vote was lost, that if they'd be removed from their dad's a client who applied to move into a different public housing complex due to taunts of homo, faggot and pedo since the marriage equality debate was happening. Police telling a couple that it was their fault when their property was set on fire after they placed a rainbow flag on their fence. I'll be really clear, that was not the experience entirely of police. Police are actually incredibly supportive, but that was one person's report that they reported. Someone who became fearful of going out in public as with identifiable gay friends or gay men holding hands in case of violence stopped going out with their friends. An elderly man who felt that the survey made his whole life feel invalid despite working as a respected professional in his field. That's what was said to one of our counsellors. We also had a lesbian family receiving a signed letter from neighbours communicating how they'd all be voting no. And rainbow families with young children were being approached and handed flyers and told that they were immoral in front of their children. So they're just some of the examples of what was happening.
Give me their address.
Yeah. So the impacts on the broader community, so that was the impacts on the LGBTI community, but on the broader community we saw a change in public discourse that was acceptable and okay to say horrific things about other people. We saw the No campaign being divisive in their messaging and misinformation, and as a result we have the No campaign, the people who voted no, feeling pretty disenfranchised as well, and that's a need that we need to attend to. We saw yes voters living in no electorates having the impact of knowing that those around them probably don't support them as much as they thought. And we had relationships, family and friends, so allies of our communities, also feeling the strain and certainly perhaps even not being as much in contact with their loved ones or feeling the need to be protective and defensive on their behalf. Some of the positives, we saw increased visibility, which is brilliant. How good was it for our communities to see other people and allies coming forward? We saw a shift in attitude. And if we look at the spectrum, we went from tolerance of, oh yeah, whatever people do in their bedrooms is okay by us, to even moving into acceptance and celebration, which is wonderful. We saw a mobilisation of the community, which included community groups that were started up and new and established in regional metro areas. And we saw allies like nothing before coming together and taking it on because it was identified it was everyone's responsibility. So if there was a silver lining, there was some, which is great, and that's lasting stuff we really want to capitalise on. So the question is now, what now? So we know the process is done, but the impact and the next steps are still things we need to work on. So some quick tips for service providers in the room. Don't assume all service users are heterosexual or cisgendered. I'm going to talk about how you can do that. Be aware of unique and social emotional needs that LGBTI people face. Respond supportively when someone discloses they're LGBTI. It makes a difference as to whether they do that again. Challenge homophobia and transphobia, and ensure your policies reflect this and how you're going to deal with it if it happens. Demonstrate your practice is inclusive LGBTI people. I'm going to go into that a little bit more detail. And develop appropriate and inclusive referral pathways. So the tips. Develop relationships with your local and state-wide LGBTI services. We've got up there the Gender Centre 2010, which is for youth. OOI, which is Intersex Australia. Rainbow Families and Q-Life, they're just some. It's important if you're doing work with LGBTI people that you work with the community-based organisations that are endorsed by that community. Also consider organisations that have specialist programs, Beyond Blue, Inner City Legal Centre, Relationships Australia, Glow Police Officers, WayAhead and many, many others. Become a visible ally. I raided a lot of pins at work and unfortunately I wish I'd chosen to wear black, they stand out a bit more. But things like put up signs in client areas that you're welcoming. You'll see up there LGBTI Safe Place, we're about to relaunch that to be welcome space because it's different, the environment's different. And that's a program organisations, health services and communities can sign up to and follow a charter and display that. And our communities look for those signs. It's a difference whether we walk through the door or not. Wear a badge or pin. I've got on my red ribbon for HIV. I've got on a little ally, and I've got a rainbow one, and I've also got my gender pronoun being she and her, which gives people a cue too and helps people know how to talk with me in my pronouns. They're all things that are signs that we really appreciate. Actively talk about being an ally and attend some LGBTI inclusion events. Hey, Mardi Gras is at our doorstep. There's like over 100 events to go to over 2 weeks. I keep having to tell my family it's not just the parade. There's a lot more to it. I've put queer screen programs there, but there's a lot of things. You've got Fair Day on Sunday at Victoria Park. Please come along. Got the parade. There's so many things there. The one thing I'll note with that, however, is just be mindful. Just because you stick a rainbow flag somewhere, that's not your job done. You've made a visible sign, I'm going to be welcoming and inclusive, then you need to do the work to back that up. Referrals. Provide a list of referral options and have them for your staff. Communicate those pathways. Have them on your websites, on your client newsletters, within your reception. Have those brochures. I've got some of ACON's brochures there. You're welcome to grab, but also request. We'll send you some out of ours. Workforce development is a big thing, because if we look at culture changes within services, you need to do that with your workforce. They're your change agents. So ensure staff have been trained in LGBTI inclusive practice. ACON provides free training within government contracts with PHNs and Ministry of Health for certain health areas. But we also do fee-for-service training, which is pretty affordable, $1,500 for half a day, $2,500 for a full day for up to 25 people. Value for money there. It's $100 a day for really great training. That's my little plug. And we're also going to be launching some e-learning coming up, which is even more accessible, and I think it's going to be about $40 a person, so keep an eye out for that. But there's other training that's available in programs that can support beyond ACON. Policies and procedures. Making sure they're inclusive. One of the things we hear from our workforces that come to our training is it's all great, but I need management to help have the systems in place that let me do what I need to do. So ACON has Pride in Health and Wellbeing, which is a member organisation, and it's made affordable. We've tried to pitch it at Health and Community Services, and the idea is it's communities of practice who will walk with you and help you on your journey, and help you review your policies and procedures, help you to implement the things you need to, and you get your own relationship manager to hold your hand through it. There's also Rainbow Tick, which is accreditation, an additional step to QUIP accreditation. It's brilliant, it's the gold standard, but it's costly. I'll be really honest about that. It's costly and it takes years. Uniting is one of the only services out there that has it, and that took them about 3 years to get it, and a lot of resourcing. So it's a good thing to work towards, and this program will help you get there, but it doesn't have to be your end goal. It's a great thing to have though. Data collection. Intake forms and paperwork that are inclusive. These are the indicators that we recommend at ACON. Probably hard for you to see, but it's not just a simple 1 or 2 questions. It actually needs to be a bit more nuanced than that. Because if you've got male, female and other, you're not actually getting the picture. So they're available on our website, and without them you don't have the data to inform your work. You don't know who's coming to your services. You don't know if they're the ones who are linked to care, if they're the ones who come beyond that first session. Therefore, are you actually doing inclusive practice that works? And what's their experience of your service compared to other consumers or service users? So really vital, and we need that data to help inform our programs to actually be able to have an evidence base. Not too many more, I think I've got 2 slides to go. Increase positive messages and celebrate diversity. The one up here, the LGBTIQ diversity days, we have days across the year that celebrate our communities, and it's a really good way to get that message out and to show it. So you've got Wear It Purple for young people, that happens. Bi Visibility Day, Transgender Visibility Day, International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia. Got Mardi Gras, there's so many of these events. The diversity calendar will actually let you know about them. If you want to know more, there's postcards about them, and you actually get e-packages of email signatures, PDF flyers and social media tiles for you to do that within your own networks. Doesn't always have to be about the hard stuff with our communities. It's great to celebrate. And address discrimination. We need to call out non-inclusive language or behaviour. We need to be vigilant against harmful behaviour, conversations, but you need your staff to know how to handle these. And you need your staff not only to know about how to handle it within their colleagues, but also the service users and the clients, because actually it's usually their experience of fellow service users which is particularly impacting. And promote inclusion. So the ways that you can go beyond the rainbow flag, which is brilliant to have. I tell you, we look out for them. We've got radar for those things. There's other things you can do. You can put gay press in your reception. So you've got Star Observer and Lottle. Lottle's for lesbians on the loose. Star Observer, more general, but tends to be a bit more for gay and bisexual men in its content. Freely available, if not low cost. Be at events like Fair Day. It's a great way to show the community and to be part of it. And I showed you some of our promotional materials, but use the faces and the images of LGBTI people in your publications so that they're not just your heteronormative images. So explicitly state that you're welcoming that way. ACON is very happy to help, so please let us know how we can. I've got my business cards there and a few goodies. But like I mentioned, they're the things that we offer. Please take them up and see how we can support you. And that's it for me. We've got questions and answers after, and I endeavour that if there's something I can't answer, I will come back to you with the people who might be able to help. So I look forward to having further chat and hearing your questions. Thanks.
We've had some fairly interesting questions submitted, so I think I might read them out verbatim.
Right.
Very good. So I'll start off with, I work for a well-known multicultural company where we welcome new refugees and migrants. So respect. A lot of staff are not well versed in the LGBTI community, and a lot of new arrivals have little or no understanding of the sensitivities of the community. Where do I start?
Ooh, this is a big one. Certainly we see a lot of refugees and new arrivals coming with very different lived experiences to what their home countries were, and often even in languages there isn't the words for LGBTI, and it makes it very difficult to have those conversations. So hats off to whoever's doing this work and thinking about LGBTI people, because we have very persecuted people coming to Australia who are often fleeing those countries for fear of death and harm to families and loved ones. So it's a real issue. What do we do in that space? And where do we start? It's a hard one because often the lived experiences back at home, people are coming here, and when they're coming here, it's like back home is frozen in time for how it looks for them. And so back home might actually be progressing in their own LGBTI rights and how things, the discourse. But within the communities, the cold communities in Australia, it's a bit frozen in time. And so people who are coming and naturally connecting in with their fellow Australians who are of their background are having, I guess, an experience like back in their homelands, and it's difficult to make that transition. We certainly saw that with the No campaign and how that came about, and people, I guess, utilising that. How do we work with it? I guess be aware of different support services and advocacy needs. ACON, if people require some help, particularly with things like residency and visas, there's organisations that can help with that. There's also a queer group, I'll have to look it up, I'll get it sent out to you, that actually helps people with that paperwork and helping people walk through the processes of residency, which is a free service. Other things are, I guess, I don't know what support and community groups there are. Cold community groups, LGBTI community groups, are often really quiet. They're on the down low. They're not advertising, promoting themselves because of the stigma within those communities. So get in touch with ACON and other community-based organisations and we'll help link you in. They're often closed Facebook groups that you get an invitation to, and that's your way in. So I think it's working with those community-based organisations, hearing what options are available, and where possible providing information which I guess lets them know that that might be that it's a supportive service. ACON has a number of programs, which particularly Asian gay men, though we try not to, we're funded a lot for HIV and gay men's issues. But we have specific projects for Asian, people of Asian backgrounds and Aboriginal backgrounds, and there's certainly a need we're seeing to put things into more diverse languages. So we'll point you in the right direction. Multicultural mental health service is a really good service to link people in with. They have interpreters as well as a range of resources and counselling services, and we often work in partnership with them. And if someone's living with HIV, because we have people who are students who get diagnosed here a lot with HIV, or who have come here and learnt through that process that they are actually HIV positive, often through spousal visa applications. So often women of South East Asia and Sub-Saharan African nations who are learning that they're HIV positive in that process, and they've come with often their husband, and they're heterosexual. So the multicultural HIV service is another really important service. I hope that's kind of helped to answer a bit of that.
Can I make a suggestion?
Please.
Recently, thank you, Jonathan. Recently, SBS launched a website about cultural competence for people. Anybody can access it, but I think it's an excellent tool for people in the workforce. And I think the person that put that question in, they're not on their own. And we need, I think if we had an online, maybe ACON could fund it, an online competence, LGBTIQ competence thing, then people could do it privately at work if they were feeling that they really were struggling.
Yeah, it's very true. Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And I might just add that, it's just the same as in Australia, when the rules and the leadership say it's okay, you get a lot more buy-in from the population. So if it's possible for you to have some conversation with the community leaders and for them to say that becoming more tolerant is not about losing your identity as someone who comes from a particular background, but it's actually about becoming a better person in a way, and it's still very consistent with all of your rules and values. That can be very helpful, I think.
Yeah. Look, I'll echo that. SBS resource is excellent, and very much work with your community leaders. We had Jewish groups, we had a Muslim collective come through to support marriage equality. So there are great leaders out there that, by all means, utilise them. I'm also aware of Pacific Island group who have been working really hard to make their communities more embracing, particularly of transgender, recognising that they've always had gender diverse people. It goes back to the beginning of time for them. There's always been the third gender. So there's a great work being done. So it's about tapping into those, and by all means, if we can help you, that would be a good way to go.
So you mentioned data is not representative.
Yes.
What research would you like to see conducted for the LGBTI community, and what extra data might help?
We want it all the data we can get. Oh, look, I think every second meeting I'm talking about data and gender and sexuality indicators. So it's up on our ACON website. So we talk about getting people to identify their gender assigned at birth, the gender that they identify with, and that helps us to identify if someone is transgender or gender diverse currently. We also ask about sexuality, so sexual orientation. So I think it ends up being 4 or 5 questions we ask. So it needs to be a little bit more staged to help us to get the nuance. That's one of the challenging things about the LGBTI community. We don't fit neatly into boxes, and we don't like to be. So that's a bit of a thing. In terms of data collection, look, we have a few things. We've got Gay Periodic Survey, which we do with UNSW, which is excellent, particularly talks about sexual health experiences of gay and bisexual men. We have SWASH, which is a partnership with Sydney University, and it's actually the longest running survey of its kind, we think even worldwide, on lesbian, bisexual and queer women's experiences, health needs. They're both running at the moment with our community. And then we've got other publications, but we often need to look overseas, which is the sad thing, because there isn't a lot in Australia. We have to try to help translate that to an Australian context. The basics would be, if you're looking, whenever you collect data, you want to be doing it for the benefit of the client, not just for collecting data. It's about duty of care and ethics. So you always want to be able to ask gender and sexuality, and to have them really explicit on your forms is a really good message to our communities that actually you can ask other things and have conversations beyond which they might not otherwise imagine that they'd have. I think really good things are being able to get that information and being able to actually look at how many sessions are people coming for and being able to follow up why might that be. It'd be really good if people had LGBTI service users on any of their advisory groups and getting that information for client satisfaction. You can do anonymous surveys, but actually asking for satisfaction, actually how do you identify? Often we'll instantly ask male or female. We might ask, do you identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? Including some of that sexuality and gender indicator will be really rich. I'd also encourage you, if you are looking to publish, even if it's a really small data set, there's a lot you can do with it. It can be really hard to publish. ACON comes up against this all the time, but there's ways of doing it. And if you want to do any research with LGBTI communities, ACON has an ethics committee that will help endorse, because we don't promote anything without our own ethics endorsement, and will actually give you really good feedback on any research that you're doing in the process to help you along the way. I hope that helps.
Add something as a data nerd.
Love data nerds. Yes.
I'm actually a massive data nerd. I do want to add that I think some information, data about LGBTIQ people will never be captured while there's stigma. At the moment, I've done some research into men who have sex with men. That's a very hard population to quantify in terms of data, because the people engaging in those activities don't identify as LGBTIQ. They won't put it on a form, even if the form has 100 questions, saying, have you ever had a same-sex experience? They will not answer. And stigma is a big part of that, and stigma also influences a lot of other people who have other experiences. Even if it's a totally anonymous survey, that stigma and internalized discrimination means that data can't be captured. We won't get an accurate number of how many people have these experiences.
Yeah. There's over there too.
Yeah, it was just a bit of a follow-up question. I work with young people, and I find it almost challenging to even want to have to ask that question, and it's almost I don't want young people to be outing either themselves or others, or coming out, or if that's even a necessary thing to be asking. So I find it challenging. What's the best approach to capture that data but not doing it in a traumatic
Can I speak to that?
Yes.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Question,
Yeah, great. There was a big aged care reform which actually mandated LGBTI services, aged care services, to be LGBTI inclusive. And one of the big things that they found was people were more concerned about being asked questions about their finances than if they were, how they identify with sexuality and gender. And if we look to the experiences of people when we had the data inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, when people understand why you're collecting that data, it makes it easier. And actually it's often our apprehension asking the question, not the person who's answering it. So I'd actually relay that you asking the question, people aren't afraid to answer. If they're heterosexual, they just go, hey, I'm heterosexual, and it's done deal and it's fine. They're not worried about that question, it's more us who's often worried. But asking that question gives them big red flags of, this person's okay, this person's going to help me, this person's actually going to show more of an interest in my needs. So it's actually really good. I tend to start if I'm doing an intake, so we do a couple of stages where we ask people questions. If it's an intake, we just ask, how do you identify with your gender? How do you identify with sexuality? We keep it open-ended at that stage, and then it's up to the worker on the forms to get the nuance. I hope that kind of helps.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, and I think it's just letting people know why. We're asking that question to make sure the services are tailored to your needs, and that we actually get funding that helps make that happen too, which is what the push was for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander indicators.
Sorry, Jonathan, we think there's something wrong with the mic. We think it's the battery in the mic.
May be running out in the microphone.
It might be
I
causing-
can talk loud. It's all good.
We might try and... I know where the batteries are.
Yes.
All right. We're actually getting to the end of the
Yeah.
Can I let it run, or?
I
think we're all right. I mean, I was going to ask one very quick question,
Please.
which was simply, do you think that gender stereotyped roles, in particular, play some sort of, play a role in the fact that there's more domestic propensity for violence between same-sex
Yep.
couples
as opposed to opposite sex couples. Apparently.
Yes, most definitely, and I'll give a little bit of colour to that if you like. There's a few factors. Most definitely it's about the stereotypes, and that, you know, violence doesn't happen between two men, or violence doesn't happen between two women. You hear things like, and people saying, police or other services saying, but there isn't rape between people of the same gender. Well, yeah, there is. It just looks different. It's certainly about how relationships and dynamics happen. It's quite common in the LGBTI community that there isn't always a dominant perpetrator. It can actually be really nuanced in that there's often two parties in different ways and how it plays out. And DFE plays out across different ways, not just physical. It's often really about financial is a big one, withholding of medications, outing of people, putting people... domestic and family violence.
Oh, I just know.
Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Not deep
no.
vein thrombosis.
Yeah. So it often plays out a little bit differently, how it happens. The other thing that we know is LGBTI people don't have good role models and don't have relationships that they can see to show them. They've got parents who are often in heterosexual relationships, and so they don't know how the gender roles work when it's not gendered as a relationship. And with that, often the stats are that it's the first relationship that people most experience domestic and family violence. And when you're already wanting to protect that relationship, you're not likely to disclose it. You're going to hide it. You're going to perhaps stay in that relationship longer, and it sets the pattern for your future relationships. So for us, when we're looking at domestic and family violence, it's really important we're working with young people in their first relationships and what healthy relationships look like and having that conversation. So I hope that answers a little bit.
Oh, I think so. Once again, leadership and rules and roles play a crucial role in setting our expectations and how things ought to operate.
Yep.
But I think you've given us some...
Oh no, I was just going to add, ACON has a wonderful resource called The Other Closet.
The Other Closet.
The Other Closet, yep. That's a PDF booklet, but please also have a look at Say It Out Loud. I'll include this in an email that can be distributed. It's a beautiful website. It has short films, which 8 were released, actually talking about healthy relationships where community members are talking about they're beautiful, beautiful mini documentaries. And there's resources for health professionals on healthy and also when there is domestic and family violence. So really important resource. And another closet sits on it, definitely.
Very good.
Fab.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have time for. So I'd just like to once again ask everyone to extend their thanks to Sara Lambert for coming here.
Thank you for staying back, and please grab my business cards. If anyone has questions, I can point you in the right direction. Thank you. Hopefully.
There's extra resources from ACON at the front there.